You're listening to the Utah Checkdown Podcast. And now your host, Josh Furlong.
Welcome back to another edition of the Utah Checkdown Podcast. I am Josh Furlong. Happy to be back with you once again. It's another week. It's a Tuesday. If you can't tell on my voice, I'm still trying to get over that cold from last week. So it's not been fun, but worse things could happen. That's for sure. So busy episode today. Let's jump into it. So first, let me tell you about our partners, UFirst Credit Union. With your UFirst Rewards checking account, you can earn monthly reward points for buying something special for your best friend. Then you can redeem your reward points for something special for yourself. And with no monthly maintenance fees plus free ID theft protection, you can love that UFirst Rewards checking is big on perks and peace of mind. Put your checking account to work for you so you can spend more time doing more rewarding things. It's easy rewards checking with UFirst Credit Union. Check out the full details at uFirstCU.com. All right. Let's just jump into this. It's been another busy week of Utah athletics, and the one thing that everybody wants to know is, when is Utah going to hire a head coach for the men's team? And it's been funny because it's been kind of quiet, right? Like, there hasn't been a lot happening, and that's solely because Utah has one person in mind. And I mentioned this last time. This one person is Alex Jensen. He is the guy that is their leading candidate and is the one that everybody is in favor for. There were some interviews over the weekend to kind of round out some of the coaching search. But the where it lies now is that it's honestly now to a point where Utah is going to put forth their offer to Alex Jensen. Whether that's actually been delivered yet or not, I'm not entirely sure. However, it's expected that if he, gets the offer, that he's going to sign on with Utah. So, this is the era where we're now waiting for it to become official. Obviously, anything could happen, but everything that I've heard from the people that I've talked to is this has kind of been a done deal for a while. There's been a lot of excitement from the boosters. There's been a lot of excitement from his side in terms of wanting to be able to come to Utah. It's not always easy to leave an NBA coaching gig, especially with kind of the what am I trying to say? The kind of the notoriety that he was getting for a while, where he was being expected to be a head coach in the NBA. And it's tough to turn that down, right? It's tough to turn that down to be able to go to the college ranks. But more and more, the college ranks is becoming, this quasi-professional league. It's not there yet, right? Like, there's a lot of things that are going on into it, but it's becoming much more similar. And so you're starting to see some of these assistants in the NBA weighing opportunities to be able to coach at the collegiate level. So the timing is essentially perfect for both parties. Utah obviously knew that it was going to move on from Craig Smith pretty early meaning like probably last summer. As I mentioned, and honestly, I can't remember if I told it on this podcast or if I did it on the radio this week on ESPN 700. But it was pretty obvious from the summer that Craig knew this as well. He was fighting for his life, and he put together a roster where he could essentially, show that he can do what he needed to. And I'm going to get into kind of what he built this year in a minute, but just sticking with this Alex Jensen stuff. It's a good time, right? Like, it's an opportunity where, let's say Alex Jensen 4 years ago was offered the job, and I know he was in that, in the interviews and was being considered the last time. It wasn't as seriously considered by him, from what I've heard. The timing wasn't right. The NBA stuff was still happening, and quite honestly, I think this gave Utah an opportunity to learn. NIL was new. There was a lot of opportunities to be able to grow from this. And so I think everything kind of worked out the way that it should. Now, once again, assuming that Alex is the head coach moving forward, and, that announcement, I assume, could happen soon. I would expect this week if he does accept. I partially believe that part of this is they would get senior night over, let those seniors kind of go out with this current coaching staff. and then do it leading up into the BYU game. Take the distractions away. Now you get all the talk about Utah. I think there's some strategic sides of this that make a lot of sense, assuming that this is how it goes. Like, this is just me. If I was in the marketing side of that, that's how I would do it. I haven't heard one way or the other. Personally, I hope it's at a good time where I'm not flying in the air to Kansas City or something like that. But, crazier things have happened, and I've had to write stories on an airplane. So, life goes on. But like I said, I expect this to wrap up pretty quickly if he does accept. Like I said, I think this is probably happening this week. And you get all the attention now where you're bringing back a beloved, former player, gets the opportunity to get people rallied around. And it really just gives Utah kind of a leg up in terms of the conversations around the coaching search, right? Obviously, there's a lot of guys that you could have gone out and talked to. There's a lot of talented coaches that could be in the mix for this, and I think Utah was always at a point this time around where if it wasn't a former alumni, especially one that is supported by the boosters so much, it didn't really matter, because at the end of the day, Utah has gone various routes to be able to try to replicate success. I'm not saying that the Rick Majerus model is unimpeachable and it's, the only way that Utah can win here. But I think people have that connection with the Rick Majerus era and the players that were there and kind of the culture building and kind of what was brought, that it's real easy to kind of overlook other things and kind of get excited about those things, right? Now, whether that's fair or not, that's to be determined. And whether that will actually come about with, Alex Jensen. Once again, I'm just going to say, we're going to assume that he takes the job, okay? I'm tired of saying assuming that he takes the job. So we're just going to assume that he takes it and move on from that point. But with Alex, there's no guarantee that he's going to have success, right? It's not like suddenly this is some magic pill that Utah's been holding out on and that, like, once you hire Alex, all of a sudden everything is going to turn around. No, basketball is still very difficult. Big 12 is still very difficult basketball, and this is going to be a challenge. The thing here, though, and what it could mean for the program is that it could bring back that Utah culture in terms of trying to build something that gets people engaged, bringing people in, trying to bring Utah back to, the glory years, so to speak, and getting back to that, right? It's hard to replicate. Utah is in a far different position now than it is then. But more importantly, you also get the booster support. You get the people that are coming in that are starting to put the money to the program, right? It's long been talked about that Utah only had about $2 million in terms of NIL, and that was one of the worst in college basketball in terms of Power 4 teams, right? That's just not a lot of money to be able to work with. And so when you have, that lack of resources and, Craig Smith was already in an uphill climb trying to come here and trying to, recruit and do what he needed to without those resources, it makes it very difficult to be able to have success. Now, when you have that booster support, there's potential where that money could be doubled or tripled. I would bet that it's probably closer to that tripled number. Even if you can get to 6 million, which, it's still not going to be like the greatest number in college basketball, but if you can get to that 6 million, that's going to give you, a ton more flexibility, a lot more opportunities for you to be able to bring in players that are probably more of those star players that we talked about. As I've talked about many times on this podcast, Utah hasn't really had that star player consistently where they can just turn to them and say, okay, we're going to give the ball to you, we're going to put it in your hands, and you're going to take it over. Now, obviously, as I've mentioned, Gabe Madsen, Ezra Asar has been kind of that guy the most this year, right? Gabe Madsen's leaving. We don't know the future of Ezra Asar because the season hasn't ended. But, you've got to be able to find those guys that are going to be able to take over a team. And you've got to be able to bring consistency. So in theory, if you can bring that booster support in and you can bring that money support in, 1 and 2, you get people in the stands and you get people on the roster that are worth watching, right? And all in all, that gets fan support. Now, once again, I don't suddenly believe that because Alex Jensen is hired that the fans are just going to suddenly rally around him. Now, I'd be dumb to think that they're not, but at the same time, this has been a problem for a while where, maybe a few big games, the fans come out. And even then, I'm talking students. Students have been really lackluster in the last few years of turning out for games. There's a decent amount of people at these men's basketball games, and it's been pretty solid, especially the last little bit. Even after Craig got fired, that lower bowl especially is mostly full. The problem there is you're not getting the chaotic fans that are the students. They're not the ones. They're the ones that are leading the charge, and unfortunately, they just haven't been there. So regardless of whoever the coach is, you've got to be able to appeal to those students. You've got to be able to, bring a product that's good, but at the same time, you've got to make coming to the Huntsman Center an event, right? You've got to make it worth their time. And obviously, Utah's done a really good job of trying to put more dorms on there so there's more people on campus. But you've got to be able to make it an inviting thing where people want to come back. I graduated from Weber State, and Weber State is the ultimate commuter school. There were sometimes, I would live up there at times when I had to do different things. But for the most part, if there's an event that I wanted to go to, very few people attended it because they could just go do other things, right? They didn't have to stay up at school. They would just go do whatever they wanted to do. And unless it's some major event, it's hard to pull people there. Utah is a little bit different that way. Yes, it's still a commuter school, and you've still got that aspect to it, but you have opportunities available where you've got a larger dorm system. You've got a thriving product in the Power 4 as a Power 4 program. You've got all of the resources available to it, but you've got to be able to market to that. So that's not necessarily just an Alex Jensen thing. That has to be a university thing, right? You've got to give these students a reason to come. It's the same thing that you saw in football for some time. Yes, Rice Eccles is sold out every single year. We hear that all the time. There's a lot of support. But let's be honest, you've all seen it if you've gone to a football game, that there hasn't always been the exact same support from the student section. And surprisingly, this year was actually one of the better years where I've seen that student section show up. And despite Utah's troubles, they showed up. And, I haven't dug into why that's the case, but there's different things that you can do to be able to enhance students to be able to come. And once they get there, you've got them, right? Like, they're going to be engaged and they're going to come. If you're going to come to a basketball game or a football game or any of these other kinds of things, you're going to be excited to be able to move forward. And if you're able to do that, then you get that support. And you've seen it. If you've been to a basketball game, when you have that fan support, how different that vibe in that arena is. That team rallies around it. Okay. So all of these can come together, right? So, but just hiring Alex Jensen isn't going to be the catch-all, magic pill type thing, right? Obviously that provides some support and that provides some excitement, and winning, that has to come eventually as well. But at the same time, there's a lot more that has to go into this than just Alex. And I would hope that as part of this is if he signs on with Utah, that there's some of that conversation there, that there has to be something that goes into it to say, okay, how are we going to make the Huntsman Center of an event, right? How are we going to get this to be a place where people want to come? You can look inside of the state. You go up to Utah State. You go to BYU. Those are events. And this is not a knock necessarily on Utah, but it's different, right? Anybody that goes up to the Spectrum or goes up to, I'm drawing a blank all of a sudden at BYU, the Marriott Center, anybody that goes to those places sees it live on TV. They've witnessed it with their eyes, that this is an exciting place to be. And that's not to say that the Huntsman Center can't be that. When Utah has some momentum and when things are going well, that Huntsman Center is rocking. It's honestly an incredible place to be able to watch a game. The problem is it just hasn't been consistent. And so it's just, you have feast or famine, essentially. You have some games where it's like, okay, everybody shows out and everybody's having a good time. And even when the team isn't doing well on the floor, the crowd is involved and they're doing what they can to be able to push forward and rally that team. But that's, you've got to have that more consistently. And I'm not saying, everybody should show up if Utah's playing Northern Colorado, but at the same vein, why not? What else are you doing in the middle of winter other than being in basketball? And so I think there's a lot of these things that needs to change, right? It's not just a coach. I think if Utah is going to be serious about this, they have to be serious about all of it. It was similar with the football team. Utah had to go from a complete overhaul on the offensive side of the ball. And you could do a few things and you could say, okay, we're going to change the offensive coordinator and just keep a few things steady. But that doesn't really, work. That's just putting a Band-Aid over a problem. I'm not saying that couldn't have worked, but I think where you were at is that Utah needed a complete overhaul on the offensive side of the ball. They needed a cultural change. They needed, you needed a whole mindset shift to be able to say, okay, if we're going to compete on offense in the Big 12, this is who we have to be. And so they did it. They went out and got dynamic coaches that are personable, that are out there and being able to just get people excited. Mark Atawaya, the running back coach, is incredible to watch on social media because he has his Freestyle Fridays. He's open to the public. He's talking about the things that he's doing. He's showing the sacrifices that he's making that makes you feel like what he's doing is worth it, right? And some people, they're not that showy. I'm not saying you have to be that. But I think when you peel the curtains back a little bit and you get people to see the effort that you're putting into it, it's much easier to get engaged in that because you're like, look, they're putting their entire life on hold to be able to make sure that we have a great football team, right? Like as a fan, if you're looking at that, you can say, okay, you know what, I'm gonna show up because I want to support that effort. But if you don't highlight that and you don't get people that are going to do that and you don't have that complete overhaul, it doesn't matter. You can bring in Alex Jensen, and he can be the best coach that's ever been there. But if you don't get the changes that need to be done, that being NIL, that being fan support, that being, a place of where these guys go to play, where it's exciting, if you can't bring that as a full culture, then it doesn't really matter. Like I said, Alex Jensen could be the greatest coach out there. And if he doesn't have the NIL to do it and he can only work with $1 or $2 million, it's hard for him to be able to do that because you just don't have the resources that everybody else has. And then you're not getting the support in the Huntsman Center. And then you're not getting what you need. That makes it a challenge. But I think this is kind of that era where Utah's looking at and saying, we have to make a change. And if they don't make a change, we may be back here in 3-4 years. And then it becomes the problem because now you just hurt an alumni. You hurt that relationship, and that's the challenge of always hiring that, right? Now, as part of this, if Alex Jensen does come on as the coach, there's a real likely possibility that Andre Miller will come in some capacity. That's at least what I've heard. That one I haven't got as much intel on, though I know that there is some interest there. Now you've got two, former alumni who understand the system, have great abilities in what they do in their respective areas. Alex Jensen, when he coached for the Jazz, he was one of the big people that everybody credited for helping Rudy Gobert become a defensive player of the year after year after year. You've got Andre Miller, who was in the NBA for 20 years and understood exactly what it took to be a guard. And I would argue that some of Utah's biggest problems is not having the best guard play. When Utah has a good guard, they've generally been able to be much better. If you have that facilitator or the guy that can just be the guy where he's your spot-up shooter or, puts it in his hands, that's been a huge advantage for Utah. So if you can get somebody like Andre Miller in there to be able to help that, that's a huge benefit. Now you've checked off that alumni, obviously a beloved member of that national championship appearance team. You get a lot of that brings you some stability. Now with that, you still got to round out the rest of your coaching staff. And I would argue that you could probably save Josh Eilert and David Evans from the current staff. I've heard a lot of great things of Josh Eilert being able to do really well with these bigs, right? You're seeing somebody like an Ezra Asar who's really kind of stepping up and becoming the guy that he is to the credit of somebody like a Josh Eilert. Now, granted, Ezra's starting to gain more confidence in himself, right? And some of that's, him and his workload. But you're getting a coach that's working. David Evans has been great in the state of Utah, whether his connections with Wasatch Academy or different things with the recruiting base and different stuff that way. These are two coaches that I think would be of great value if Utah can hold on to them. Now, obviously, Jensen has to decide if that's what he wants. But I think if you can keep them, that gives Utah a great leg up. And especially with Josh Eilert, You get somebody that has been in the Big 12 for a very long time and understands how it goes. So for somebody like Alex Jensen, who's coming into his first coaching gig at the collegiate level in terms of a head coach, he coached with Rick Majerus for a while at St. Louis, but as a head coach, you now have somebody that can help you. And David Evans, especially if you can keep him as well, now you have two coaches that can kind of reinforce the way that the Big 12 does things. And so you get some of that where you can have some consistency that way. Now, that's not to say that he can't go out there and find other coaches, right? Like there's a million assistant coaches out there that are great and that can do great things. So, it's not like this is the only way that Utah can have success. But I think if you want to be able to blend some consistency, you can have that. Now, I talked about having a full reset. A full reset doesn't have to mean everybody goes, right? We saw that, like I said, with football. Not everybody left the staff. There was things that were still working well, and they wanted to keep. This can be the same thing. You want to keep the best people in the best seats, right? There's a book, I'm blanking on what it is, but you want to have the best people in the right seats, right? If Josh Eilert and David Evans are those people, then you want to keep them. And so we'll see what happens, how Alex Jensen would round out that coaching staff if this were to happen. So we'll see. Now, the next step beyond that would have to be who on this roster, if any, do you want to keep? Who are the priorities, right? Now, assuming that you have more money, you obviously want to attract some other players, and you can probably bump up some of these other players with NIL and different things. And ultimately, it's going to be their decision, right? These players have to decide what they want to do, and if they feel like the model that Utah is going to roll out is going to fit their style, then great. All of these players had a great connection with Craig Smith. They were personally recruited by Craig to be able to come to the system. So it's real easy to, have that loyalty and not necessarily to Utah. Now, I think all of these guys have bonded and done well at Utah, and they like the university. But let's say Craig Smith gets another job somewhere that's an attractive place and he has some NIL. There's not to say that wouldn't be the first jumping place for some of these guys, right? They very well may get NIL money from a bunch of other bigger programs, right? And so I think that's the nature of this. But I think if you're looking in terms of priority, the guys that you want to keep, that list becomes very interesting. And I've gone back and forth on this several times. But I'm putting number one on that list as Keanu Dawes. Now, I can make an argument that Ezra Asar could be there, and I'll get to him in a second. But I'm going to go with Keanu Dawes, one, because he's younger. He's shown flashes. He's got a lot of physicality. He's developed a shot that seems like he can be that guy that you could turn to that can hit jumpers, 20-foot jumpers, 15-foot jumpers. He's shown that he can hit the 3-point. He's physical. He's aggressive. He wants to get in there, and he wants to do right. Now, he's still a player that has to learn, right? He's still not a finished product, but I think he's one of the upside for him, the ceiling for him is pretty high. And if you can, get that unlocked, I think that becomes a great asset for Utah, and a great opportunity for them to be able to have a guy that has been in the system that can be aggressive and that can do well in Utah. So for me, he's kind of your number one guy. After that, you get Jake Walling. The fact that of the jump that he made from last year to this year shows a ton, right? Coming off of a mission is not always easy. And last year, I saw the tweets and people were frustrated by Jake, and they didn't really like his game, and they kind of wondered why he was out there. And then he made a big jump this year. Now, there's some regression that he's had at times where he hasn't become the player that he was early on, and that's to be expected. These non-conference games, a lot of these guys can pop off, and then you get into conference games and you kind of shrink a little bit. But I think, once again, he's another guy with a tremendous ceiling that can work for Utah. He can play multiple positions. He's got that length where, you can mix him up and put him with guards. You can mix him up and put him in with forwards. If you really needed to, you could put him up with some centers. He's going to go in there and he's going to fight for the ball. He gets a lot of rebounds. He can be a spot-up shooter. There's a lot to like about what Jake Walling brings to the table. And if he can continue to make those progressions from a year-to-year basis, this becomes a great asset for Utah, especially as a local kid, to be able to keep that Utah recruiting base, right? most likely he'll have offers, right? Most of these guys will have offers. And so you've got to figure out what value you're willing to attach to them. There's going to be some schools that are just going to pay a price, especially in basketball. I feel like you can make a difference with money faster than football. But so you throw some money a guy's way, and suddenly, they may have everything, great at the university that they're at, and, that can change. Now, I don't think people are necessarily going to throw a ton of money at Jake Wallin, but I wouldn't be surprised if BYU takes a look at him, right? Obviously, was committed to BYU, decided to come to Utah. There's an opportunity there. Granted, BYU has a ton of talent there that they've bought that, maybe that isn't what he wants. But, you can see there. Now we get to Ezra Asar. So I've put him at 1 or 3, which sounds kind of funny, but I think the reason I'm putting him at 3 is because he's probably going to get a ton of offers. And so the reason that you put him probably there as not as high of a priority is because he's going to merit a ton of money from people. And if you're going to go spend new NIL money, especially let's assume that you just get to 6 million. That's funny because that's triple of what Utah's had. But let's just say you get to 6 million. Do you want to use a lot of that to be able to keep Ezra? Maybe. That's going to be the deciding factor for this coaching staff. I personally think Ezra has a ton of upside as well. I think you're starting to see him become more confident. You're starting to see him understand that he can play at this level. And as he's doing that, he's been able to be one of Utah's best players. Now, there's still some things that he needs to do to finesse his game, right? Like he gets in that post and he dribbles a little too much. He loses the ball. And kind of gets lost a little bit. But for the most part, he's a guy that is going to be aggressive. He's physical. He knows how to be able to work around the rim where he can get the head fakes, or he knows how to just twist his body in a way. Obviously, he brings down the hammer dunks. I mean, this is a guy that will fight for you, and he's not going to cause a lot of drama. Now, it could be real easy for him to say, look, I'm the guy on this team. This is my show. But so far, he hasn't been that guy. He's been a humble guy who works hard, obviously has a lot of pride in himself, and he has a lot of belief in himself, but you're starting to see a lot of that unlock with him, and I think that could show a tremendous amount of potential for Utah. But once again, depending on the NIL offers and what he's going to get on the market, you have to weigh, is that worth it? Do you have a better opportunity maybe locking up a guy like Keanu Dawes, who's younger, has maybe more of an upside? Or do you try to stick with somebody that is more, right now consistent and has shown that he can be able to do it at a high level? That's the question. So, I wouldn't fault anybody who decided to take Ezra over Keanu, right? Like, I love Ezra. He's a great guy. I think he would fit Utah. I think he would fit what Alex Jensen would bring to Utah. So I don't think that there's anything wrong there. I think it's just a matter of priorities and how you want to weigh that out. And so I think, that'll be an interesting situation moving forward. And maybe Ezra doesn't even want any attention on Utah, right? Maybe that's not even a situation. We'll see. I mean, it's hard to say, okay, these guys are a priority, and then they just don't have any willingness to want to stay at Utah. And especially with the new coaching staff, it's hard to know. So there's that. My last one in this current roster would be Mike Sharvjumps. And the reason for my putting him on there is because of his length. And if you can get him to be able to be a more consistent guard in terms of not turning the ball over and being able to make the right reads, he becomes an asset that you just don't get very often, right? You don't get a guy of his size and his ability. His passing can be elite, and it can also be a situation that gets Utah in trouble when he turns the ball over. But if you can get him more consistent, he becomes a valuable asset for you. If you can get his three-point shooting at a more consistent rate, now he's a three-level scorer where he can do anything, right? He can go in there into the post. He's got the hops where he's always looking down when he jumps up. That's how high he jumps. He's looking down at the rim where he can just lay it in, right? He's got the aggressiveness. He can do it. The problem is he just hasn't been as consistent. But I think he's still a guy that you want to be able to bring that brings value to this team, especially if you can bring in somebody that's going to help him with that guard play. If you can get him to turn over that ball less, I think this becomes an incredibly valuable asset. Now, Sharvjumps has transferred a couple times already, right? Like it's not like he's afraid of doing that, but has he found a place where he feels comfortable And if he likes the new coaching staff, does that give him an opportunity to be able to thrive? That one I'm fascinated by, because once again, the biggest reason Utah's had some of the success that they've had this year is because of their length. A guy like Mike Sharf jumps out on the perimeter defending you is going to be very difficult, at least size-wise, right? Like, he's got to be able to stay in front of his man. He's got to do those types of things. He can't get beat on, whatever it may be, but you've got to be able to have that length. And if you can do that, I think this team can continue to make the progress that it needs. And I think, even with a new coaching staff, if you can keep a core of these players together, 2, 3, 4 of them together, that gives Utah a huge advantage moving into next year. Consistency, being able to be together for a while, that camaraderie and everything, that matters. You see that. I've mentioned this in previous podcasts with Houston. Houston has been able to keep their team together for a long time. They're not always the highest rated recruits. Now, some years they are. I think it was last year, this year, upcoming year, where they have a highly rated recruiting class, right? It happens. But this is a team that, generally speaking, outperforms its recruiting rankings because they have consistency. They've got a system that they employ that is works to a T, and they've been together forever. And if you can do that, those are those teams that win in March. Those are those teams that can go on those deep runs because they understand each other. They don't get worried about other things, or different situations, because they've been working with each other for 2-3 years now. And obviously that's more rare in this era of the transfer portal and the NIL era. But if you can find some consistency, especially with your core players, you're going to be fine. The reason why the Utah women's basketball team has had so much success is because of that. They know how to play with each other. They understand each other at a level that you just don't get for people that come in on the first year. And yeah, you have 20 games together and you get some chemistry. But if you've been building that chemistry for the last 3-4 years, it just becomes second nature. And anything in this sport, if you don't have to think about it, the easier it gets. We hear that with athletes all the time. They don't have to think about it, especially in football. Oh, I don't have to think about this, and now I can just go out and do it. When it becomes second nature, it becomes so much easier to play that game. And that's no different in basketball, especially in those guards, and especially in the forwards, especially if you're trying to play an inside-out game. Feeding the ball into the post is a very difficult thing. It's not that easy. You've got a lot of hands there. You've got a lot of people vying for that ball. And if you don't have accuracy and you don't know where a player moves and you don't know how they, roll off of a player or come off of a screen, it becomes really easy to get a turnover, and that's where Utah's been this year. Granted, some of those have just been terrible throws anyway into the post, and it hasn't been great. But the point that I'm making is if Utah can find a way to be able to have consistency there and have guys that have worked together for a while, that gives them an advantage, and that would be a huge boon to what Alex Jensen could do. Yeah, he could be a great coach, and he could do some great things and maybe bring in some more talent with some more money. But at the end of the day, you've got to be able to find consistency, and you've got to be able to move forward with that. So we'll leave that talk. I delayed my podcast to Tuesday, hoping that we'd get some news today. I don't know when we're going to get it. I'm probably going to be in Kansas City when that happens. But I think everything's trending that way towards Alex Jensen. I think this is the area where Utah is going to move, barring him saying no. From everything that I've heard, I don't imagine him to say no, but there could be, things that hold this thing up or whatever that may be. But I understand that Utah is very keen on bringing him in. Outside of that, if Utah doesn't land Alex Jensen, I think this goes into another full reset. They've interviewed guys, and I think they have some candidates that would be great. But at the same time, I think this would be a full reset of kind of their mindset of where they want it to be. So we'll see what happens with that. Tonight, this is Tuesday, is senior night for the Runnin Utes. They will play West Virginia. This is Josh Eilert's former team. Last year before the season, Bob Huggins, was removed from the job, and Eilert became the interim head coach for the entire season and coached the team up really well. Everybody was expecting him to be able to get that head coaching position, and then they decided to go another way. And so this means something to him, right? Like, it means something to him just to be able to go against his former team. But more importantly, this is senior night, and he wants to be able to give those guys a great opportunity to go out on a high note, right? Unfortunately, they're not able to do it with the coach that brought them there, and Craig Smith. A guy like Gabe Madsen, Craig Smith was everything to him. And, that's part of the business, and that's what happens. But it is unfortunate that he's not able to see that out. But as I've mentioned, I think the timing works that they had to kind of do it this way. And, as frustrating as it can be and as hard as that can be, I think this was the right move for Utah. So you do have that senior night. This is an important game for Utah in terms of seeding. And I say that relatively because Utah, they're most likely not going to get a top 8 seed at this point. How they could get a top 8 seed, though, is they'd have to be able to beat West Virginia. They have, according to ESPN, they have a 56% chance of beating West Virginia at home. But then they'd have to also beat BYU on the road. That one is an 18% chance. And given the way that BYU has been playing lately, that one becomes a very tall task, right? Like, yeah, you beat them at the Huntsman Center, but I think BYU is a completely different team than they were that night. Granted, Utah is as well. But I think the way that BYU is made up lately and the way that they've been able to gel makes this a very difficult place. And unless you can go up early and you can fight through the adversity of being able to play up there and the energy and everything, that is a very difficult task. But if Utah can do that, if they can beat West Virginia and they can beat BYU, they get a top 8 seed. They've got some tiebreakers that work out in their favor, namely against TCU that help. And that would be a great opportunity for Utah to get a first-round bye. But the fact that Utah's most likely going to end up as a 10 seed in next week's Big 12 tournament, finishing the season as a 10, that says a lot about what this team is able to do. Utah was picked to finish 16th at the beginning of the season. I always thought that number was too low. I just didn't see this team finishing 16th. Now, finishing 8th or 10th or whatever that may be, I don't know that I necessarily fully had it in the cards. I think 10 was a number that I was looking at that seemed to make the most sense. But this has clearly been a season where Utah has exceeded expectations. Honestly, being at 15 would exceed expectations. Not much, but you know what I mean. But I think this is a situation where Utah has done well considering everything that they've had, right? We talked about that. They didn't have the NIL. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the support. They didn't have the coach that they felt like they wanted to win. And yet, Craig Smith got this team to a 10th place finish. And, look, we're celebrating 10th place. But at the same time, given where this team was, given where they were coming into in a Big 12 conference that was incredibly difficult, if you can go out and you can finish almost 500, I think if they beat West Virginia and BYU, they would finish 500 in conference play. That's a remarkable feat for Utah. So I think there's optimism here. There's opportunities for Utah to be able to move forward and grow. But like I said, you've got to be able to bring that consistency. Right now, they're tied with West Virginia for 9th in the league. That's just kind of where they are. But looking at all the figures and kind of looking at all the projections, assuming all of the teams that are projected to win, Utah would finish as a 10 seed. There's some variabilities there that even if they, the teams that aren't projected to win don't like it, it all pretty much shakes out to 10th place for Utah, barring them beating BYU and West Virginia both. So, assuming that they are the 10 seed, they go into next week's tournament, playing Arizona State. They're the 15 seed. There's not much Arizona State can do to get out of that. So you're back to playing Bobby Hurley's team. Will he be the coach at that time? Will Arizona State move on? That's the real question. Things haven't gone well for them, and I know Bobby Hurley has been on the hot seat. I've actually heard that Craig Smith might be one of the targets that Arizona State would circle around if that were to be the case. Whether that's true or not, we'll see. But I have to imagine that he'd probably get a look. But this is, Utah played Arizona State last week. They won 99-73. I mean, this was a pretty convincing win. Arizona State just doesn't have the guys anymore. They're hampered by injury. They're shorthanded. I mean, they're just kind of limping to the end, and it hasn't been great for them. So, assuming that was the case, that gives Utah an opportunity to potentially win their first game of the Big 12 tournament. That would help them, to be able to just have some momentum. If that was the case, you're generally, based on the projections, will probably play TCU in the next round as a 7 seed. There's a chance maybe West Virginia again. It depends. I mean, they could be another team in there as well. But the two teams that are most likely are probably TCU and West Virginia. Utah obviously got a win over TCU on the road, 73-65. Played one of their best complete games of the season, and so that's still a tall task. But it's a game that you've already beat the team, and so you've got opportunities to know how you did it, right? Like you can look at that tape and say, this is how we beat them. That helps. West Virginia, if it does end up that way, you did lose to them earlier this season on the road, and depending on what happens tonight, you got that tape as well, so we'll see what goes on there. But I think, your first two rounds, in theory, can lay out well, right? Like it's not perfect. March is always difficult. All it takes is Arizona State to go on a heater and hit a bunch of three-pointers like they do, and Utah loses their first game of the Big 12 tournament and they're out, right? Like we've seen this before. This isn't anything new. That happens. TCU, you're the underdog going up against TCU. If that was the team, that's a challenge, and that's never an easy task. So you've got that. If you do get past those first two games, you would then meet up with Texas Tech. The last time that Utah played Texas Tech was at home, and they lost 93-65. If you remember that, it was early on in the Big 12 play. Utah just was not in any sort of a rhythm. This was not a good game for Utah. They were actually closer in this game early on. Turnovers spelled trouble. It just didn't work, and it ended up being a blowout. So I don't know that game is really indicative of what this game could be, but obviously Texas Tech has been playing really good ball lately. They're the number 2 seed in the Big 12, so it's not like this is just going to be a game that's going to be easy. But I think looking at this schedule and looking at what the Big 12 tournament could look like for Utah, it goes about as good as it can, right? Like nothing's going to be great, nothing's going to be easy, but I think this is a path where Utah could do some damage and have some fun. Now, once again, I don't know that it means anything in the end. Maybe it gets you into the NIT. You'd have to win the whole tournament to be able to get to March Madness, but that's not happening. Houston's winning that one. So crazier things have happened, but at the same time, I think, this one's kind of locked up. But I think at the very least, what you want to do is being able to finish strong, especially if you can keep some of those core players together. They can build on that, right? You've made a coaching change. You're going to do things that are going to be different. But if you can give yourself a leg up next year, all the more advantage for you. So there's that. Let's move on to the women's team. This week is the Big 12 tournament. I will be leaving to Kansas City tonight. I'm actually not going to be there for senior night for the men's team. I'll be heading to Kansas City where a blizzard is expected when I land. So yay for me. Next week for the men's tournament, they get all the sunshine, and I go to the women's tournament and get nothing. So getting the full KC experience. But look, I'm here for the barbecue. I'm ready for it. Let's go. The women's team, let's talk a little bit about what happened Saturday. Obviously, a very fun game. Little anxiety ridden for for fans in the Huntsman Center, which I have to point out that Huntsman Center was filled to the brim for a women's game, which is phenomenal to see. I think this is a testament to kind of what this team has done over the last few years to be able to bring a viable product to Salt Lake City, and the seniors that were being honored that night were a large part of that. Right, like they were the ones, the foundational pieces, we'll call them, to bring Utah back into the limelight, right, and allow them to be able to be a consistent NCAA tournament team. Obviously, Lynn Roberts did a lot of that work to be able to build this team, but Gavin Peterson was right there along with her, and he's continued to do a phenomenal job of taking that over. I'm curious to see kind of how that moves forward with him in the next years as he kind of puts more of his stamp on the program. But I don't think it's going to stray too far, right? Like I think he's done a really good job, and you're seeing what he can do. The real question is if this team can, live up to the expectations that they have for themselves. Regardless, that game was an entertaining game. Rivalry games are always going to be entertaining. They're always going to be emotional. BYU has some players, that can really do some damage. Delaney Gibb among all of them is the best. And she finishes with 38 points. I mean, she had a phenomenal game. There's a big reason why Utah recruited her heavily. She's going to get some interest in the portal this year. And so I'm curious to see kind of what happens with her. But regardless, it came down to, some clutch shots. Gianna Neepkins had to hit a three-pointer to tie the game up. Got the game into overtime. In overtime, it was a back-and-forth affair, and Delaney Gibb obviously is going to have the ball in her hands for BYU in the last second, right? Like, that's who you're going to give it to. There's no reason to give it to anybody else. Not that others couldn't have done well. but you want to give it to her. And unfortunately for her, as she was driving to the basket, she lost the ball, falls into Maddie Wilkie's hands, who picks it up and immediately sprints to half court. And, there was moments in the Huntsman Center where, like, obviously the crowd is standing and they're anxious and everything, but I think the tone there, the game had been tied up. Utah really just hadn't been really playing well to kind of do what it needed to stop BYU. And so I think the momentum was just like, BYU is going to go down. They're going to go win. It's going to crush all the fans there. So there wasn't a lot of like standing around. The expectation was there. I think there was just like fans settling in, waiting to be heartbroken. And then suddenly Maddie Wilkie threw up that half-court shot that banks in. And I've never seen a crowd jump the way that they did, right? Like everybody in that entire stadium jumped because I think it was just so shocking. I don't think anybody really expected it to end that way. And it just turned into a remarkable, opportunity for Utah. They get the win. It's against your rival. It's a heartbreaking loss for BYU. I mean, those things hurt, right? Like you were competitive, and for this BYU team who just hasn't really been able to click fully all season, that's one more loss that you get that was close, right? And to do it in that fashion is really tough. But phenomenal game. Maddie Wilkie had only 5 points that game, and one of those was that 3-pointer. But it was awesome to see. They play this game called Utes Win before every single game, where they're broken up into different groups. One of them, they call them the grandmas, the older women on the team. They form their own team, and the only way to win that game is you have to hit a half court shot to be able to beat your team or to beat the other teams. And so, they practice this. This is something that they do. Obviously, Maddie Wilkie is a phenomenal shooter, so if you're going to have it in anybody's hands, she's a great one to have it. I just don't think anybody was expecting it to end that way. But cool opportunity, no less. I mean, it was a fun game. That was honestly one of the funnest games I've been to in a long time. And so long time being a relative term. There's been some fun games. I mean, you can even point to the men's basketball team against the BYU team. So, fun games. They're great to be able to have. I think having BYU and Utah back in a conference together really brings value to those games, right? In the past, Utah blew out BYU last year when they weren't in the same conference, and there wasn't any appeal to it. These are two different teams that just were at different levels. This year, they're still at different levels, but it means more, right? The game in Provo was competitive, and Utah pulled out a win. The game in the Huntsman Center was competitive, and Utah pulled out a win. So I think it's just fun to be able to have that rivalry back there, and being able to just compete at a high level. In that game, Gianna Neepkins had only 2 points going into that fourth quarter. BYU did a really good job of kind of limiting her and kind of locking her up. But at the same time, she was trying to be a facilitator and trying to do other things for the team. I wrote a piece about her yesterday. You can go read about it, just talking about her efficiency. But she ends up finishing that game with 20 points, 6 rebounds, 4 assists. Most importantly, though, she was 10 of 10 from the free throw line. Those free throws especially were, the biggest clutch moments for Utah. And I'm saying that ignoring the 3-pointer that sent Utah even into overtime. So she had some phenomenal moments down the stretch that really helped Utah, that allowed them to get that win, because otherwise Utah loses that game after leading by, double digits, and they're left going into the Big 12 tournament on a down note instead of where they ended off. So she's become a phenomenal player. She finishes the regular season in that 50-40-90 club that I've talked a ton about. You've probably getting tired of me talking about Gianna Neepkins in the 50-40-90. But the reality is only 5 Power 4 players have finished inside that club all time. There's been 17 all time in all of Division I, but some of those, are at different levels. You've got different things that are harder to quantify. But in the Power 4 level, only 5 players have been able to do it. Now there's 7. Gianna Neepkins and Kennedy McQueen. Both of them have finished inside of that for the regular season. It's a remarkable feat to, 1, get in that club, but 2, to be able to have 2 athletes on your team that can do that. It kind of shows there. Gianna is obviously a much more high volume shooter than Kennedy is, but it's not like Kennedy's not shooting the ball a ton either. So both of them are phenomenal players. Right now, Gianna Neepkins, she's at 51.3% from the field goals. 3-point is at 45.3, and at free throws 90.5. She's kind of hovering on the border there. So that one's tough. But in all of history, Gianna Neepkins has shot more than anybody from 3-point and free throws and still been able to get in that club. From field goals, like the total field goals, only Sue Bird and Susan Robinson shot more, but Sue Bird had 10 more games on the season. And so, you're bound to get more points. So I'm curious, or more shots up. I'm curious to see if Gianna's able to keep this throughout the full season, through the postseason and all that. But just a remarkable feat to be able to have both of these women that have been as efficient as they had. And, talking to people, obviously, efficiency numbers don't mean anything in and of themselves. Obviously, it means that you're efficient with what you do, but it has to go beyond that, right? Like, you have to be able to be a great ball player and be able to do all that. And both of these women have been able to be that, right? They're not just sitting on the sideline, and they're not shooting the ball a ton, and they're not key contributors to the team. Both of these women have been key figures for Utah women's basketball to be able to build Utah up to what they are today. Gianna Neepkins is still undecided about her future. She had the opportunity to go through a senior night on Saturday. She's classified as a junior right now simply because she took the redshirt season from her injury last year. But at the same time, she has the options where she could weigh in WNBA future. She probably has to go on a run in postseason to really cement that. But she's being talked about that being there, and so she's got to weigh, what she wants to do in that regard. So she could come back. If she comes back, that gives Utah a great opportunity to provide some more consistency to what will be a relatively young team now. You go from a veteran team to what will be a young team that still has some pieces, right? Like, there's still Maddie Wilkie that's going to be there. There's some other pieces that are veteran players. Reese Ross, can she take that next level? So it's not all lost, but I think you bring Gianna back to Utah for one more year, and that absolutely helps Utah moving forward into the next season. So we'll see. You can read my article to kind of get the full look at what she's going through. I talked to her mom, and kind of the decisions that they're making and kind of what she's choosing to focus on right now. So we'll move ahead just because this is getting long. But the Big 12 tournament starts this week. They get a first-round bye. They were close to getting a second-round bye as well, but couldn't get into that top 4 seed. So they finished the season with a number 6 seed. I actually, made the argument on Twitter before the games were played, before the game was played against West Virginia, that being a 6 seed was arguably the best for Utah, just based on how it would lay out. As I've mentioned, with March, anything's possible. You can get to that first game and end up just going on a shooting slump, and things don't happen, or you get a team that is just hot at the right time, and it's tough. So all of this is just on paper, right? It's easy to look at this and say what it is. But going into this tournament, Utah will play the winner of Kansas or Texas Tech. Utah beat Kansas 79-61. That's the game that Gianna Neepkins just barely missed out on a triple-double by 2 assists. And so this is a team that they handled fairly well. Texas Tech was a much closer game, but they still got a win. So both of these teams, they've won this season. We'll see what happens there. You got to get that first win out of the way. If Utah can get that first win out of the way on Thursday, that bodes well for moving forward, right? And then you get the hot streak, and now you become the dangerous team that has to go against a team that's been waiting for a couple days to play basketball. The team that will be waiting for Utah, if they do advance, would be Oklahoma State. That would be the game that Utah really had for the taking. It was at home. It was the one that if you could have beat Oklahoma State, you're obviously in a top 4 seed. But it just didn't work out that way. They allowed, I'm blanking on her name all of a sudden, but she got 3 made 3-pointers in the fourth quarter that really pulled them above Utah. Utah had some situations that they just couldn't overcome, end up losing by 4 in that game at home. But I think of the top seeds, Oklahoma State is probably the easiest. Now, I say that knowing that, Oklahoma State has beat some of these top teams as well. And so it's not like this is a guarantee. I just think based on kind of the experience of the other teams, Oklahoma State is probably the easier matchup to be able to contend. And then if you do win that, you have a semifinal matchup, which will be likely Iowa State or Baylor. Obviously, it's the winner, and so you've got to be able to get to there. Utah beat Iowa State earlier in the season on the road. They did it on the road, but then they lost at Baylor, by 9 points. So these are two teams that they can contend with. Once again, this is a Utah team that can win it all, but they haven't been able to show lately that they've been able to contend with some of these upper echelon teams in the Big 12 this year. And the only big real difference is that the turnovers, right? They obviously shots have to fall, and that matters. But when Utah gets out of its rhythm and gets out of its game and then turns the ball over, and some of them have been terrible turnovers, entry passes that had no chances of being able to go in there, balls that just really shouldn't have been thrown in the direction that they're thrown, simple things that can be that aren't because of the team per se. If they can limit those, they have a much better chance of competing with a lot of these teams. So we'll see what happens. Like I said, this lays out well for Utah. But with that being said, I've seen this with men's and women where it lays out well and they go and lose the first game and everything's different. So we'll see what happens there. I'll be in Kansas City kind of reporting on that as well as BYU. I'm taking the women's side, and my BYU writer is going to take the men's side for the BYU or the Big 12 tournament. So I'll be there this week, talking all things Big 12, and we'll kind of go from there. So that's going to be it today. The NFL Combine was this last week. There really wasn't anything too special there. Junior Tafuna was the only one that competed, but he had decent times. They weren't anything jumping off the page. They weren't anything that was super remarkable. Not to say that he didn't have a good showing, but I think in comparison to some of the other players there, it was more of just an average performance. So still some work to do for him. The other players, Karene Reed and Brant Keithy, held out for injury stuff, but curious to see kind of what goes on there. As we get closer to that, the closer to the combine or the pro days and the NFL draft, we'll get more into it. But this was going to be more of a quiet year for Utah in terms of the NFL draft. So that's it from that. But we'll close out today. Hopefully you guys get the Alex Jensen news soon. If I get a chance, maybe I can do a podcast in Kansas City, but for the most part, we're going to call that good and assume that that's the case. So with that, we'll sign off, and I will chat with you guys later.